Welcome to At the Bench with Silver Dollar Productions. I just got my clock back from the shop, or I just moved my clock around. It runs for a little bit and then stops. What's wrong? This is a question that we seem to get asked several times a month, so I'm setting up this video so you can get a better idea of what is wrong and how you can go about correcting it. First off, if your clock has been running for a long period of time and just stops suddenly without you ever touching it, then this video probably isn't for you. That could be an indication of worn bearings and you're going to need professional attention. Most of the time though, a small problem develops after a clock is moved from one spot to another. This is usually caused by not removing the bob prior to moving the clock. What happens then is that the bob can get swung suddenly from one end or the other, throwing the clock out of the delicate beat that it's in. Not everybody may be mechanically inclined or have enough confidence to go ahead and work on their own movement. If you're one of those people, that's okay. Let me show you a quick and easy way that we might be able to bring this clock back in the beat using a method known as the shim method. And really all that involves is just getting like a couple of coins like quarters here. And you're going to want to start by raising one end of the clock and then just inserting the coins underneath each of the legs. Now what that does is that changes the angle of the clock just slightly. Now go ahead and start your clock and listen to the tick-tock. If the sound sounds worse than it did before, or if the clock stops sooner, then that's a good indication that possibly we raised the wrong side of the clock. In which case then remove your coins and set them on the opposite side and see what happens. Do the same thing and just see how it sounds. Now if it starts to sound a little better and is running a little bit longer but still stops, then that's telling us perhaps we need to raise this side of the clock up a little bit more. Now, the last thing you want is you don't want a clock sitting on about 3 inches of shim. So if your clock is that far out of beat, there's two things that you can do. You could either take the clock to a clockmaker and have the clock set back in the beat properly, or you can continue on and watch the next set of segments, which will show you how to do it by yourself. Before we go on any further, let me explain to you exactly what the beat is. The beat is that nice delicate tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock sound that you hear as the clock is running. Now, that particular sound is caused by this particular little gadget right here, which is known as the verge. And the verge actually connects to a top gear here called the escapement. Pardon my crude drawing here, but perhaps this will give you a little better idea of what's going on. The verge actually has two prongs on it, and the escapement gear has teeth all the way around it. Now, as this thing moves back and forth, this prong here will either capture or release one of the teeth, and this will do the direct opposite. Now, if you were to remove this entire mechanism from the inside of the clock, the escapement gear would spin at 1,000,000 miles an hour out of control until the mainspring actually unwound totally. So this is what actually controls the speed of the clock. Now, your verge has to be absolutely perfectly balanced on the escapement gear in order for the clock to run continually. Now, if you've been moving your clock around, there's a few things we want to check for before trying to reset the beat. The first is going to be this particular wire right here. This is called your suspension wire. And what happens is that this wire does have a tendency sometimes to come out or to be moved in the little bracket that's holding it. So it's important that you make sure that this is set in there and set all the way back. The second thing we need to do is to make sure that the clock is set on a level surface. If the clock isn't perfectly level, then it's not going to run properly. And this is usually helped by the use of just a small level, something like that. Now, it's important not only to check the level this way, but you also have to check the level going this way. So it has to be level in all directions. The next thing that you want to do is hang your bob back on and make sure that it's not making any contact with anything around it. This would include the case or the bottom of the case or any of the rods or wires that might be hanging. It has to be able to move freely. If it touches just anything, just a little bit, that'll be enough to stop the clock. Now that you've checked those particular areas, we're going to have to assume that the clock is actually out of beat. Now let me explain to you exactly what happens when a clock goes out of beat again. That nice even tick-tock sound that you hear indicates that the clock is in beat. Now, when I lift one side of the case up, throwing it out of balance, the tick-tock changes. Now it becomes more of a tock, tick, and as you can see, the escapement stopped, the clock stopped. Setting the beat on a clock is not a very difficult task to do, but it does require a good ear and sometimes can become very frustrating, as finding that razor thin line for a perfect beat sometimes is a little bit more difficult to do than you think. The first thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to be putting your clock on a shelf or a mantel, that's where you're going to want to be setting your beat. Don't do this on your dining room table or your kitchen counter and then try to move it back to a different position, because where you're putting the clock, the level might be just slightly different than where you set the beat, and the clock is going to end up stopping again. Now, setting the beat requires the moving or bending of this particular wire here very slowly. And what you want to do is just put your finger in here and just gently push and bend very, very, very slightly, and then release it. Let the clock start and then listen to how it's working. If the tick-tock is worse than what it was before you started, then that's an indication we're pushing the wire in the wrong way. If the clock stops sooner than it did before, that's also an indication we're pushing the wire in the wrong way. So in which case then you're going to want to bend the wire this way. Just again, very slightly, very, very small increments. Release and listen. Listen and watch. See what it does. Now, if it runs for a little bit longer, then you know you're heading in the right direction. Okay? If it stops again, you're going to want to bend just a little bit more. Release and listen. Now, it's a possibility that you might bend the wire too far and the clock is going to end up stopping again, in which case then you're going to have to start moving the wire back the opposite direction. And this is what I was trying to say before. Sometimes it's very, very frustrating, and you're going to find it's even more frustrating on the German-made clocks than American-made clocks, is that line for a perfect balance on the verge is so razor thin, it could take you several attempts going back and forth on this wire before you find the perfect beat.